It was Friday night. Sarah told me she'd be working late. Another deadline looming over her. Typical story, right? But it was strange. Sarah works in PR, and her late nights were never this frequent. Something felt off, but I kept brushing it aside, telling myself not to make a big deal out of it. Still, a gut feeling gnawed at me, a feeling I couldn't ignore. So I decided to surprise her. I ordered her favorite takeout from that Thai place she loves, picked up a small bouquet of lilies, the kind she used to leave around the house back when we were still dating, and drove to her office. I imagined walking in, seeing her smile when she looked up and saw me, maybe even squeezing in a little date right there at her desk. In my mind, it was a simple way to reconnect, to remind her, and maybe even me, of what we had. I arrived at her building around 9 p.m., only to find the place nearly deserted. The lights were off. Her floor, specifically, was dark. That pit in my stomach got deeper. I was thinking, maybe she left early and just hadn't told me? So I tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. Twice. Standing outside that empty building with a bag of now-cold Thai food and flowers in my hand, I told myself to calm down. But I couldn't shake this feeling, like something was twisting inside. So, on a whim, I decided to track her phone. I know, it sounds crazy, like some high school kid stalking his girlfriend, but I'd only ever used the Find My feature to help her find her phone around the house. I never thought I'd be using it like this. It showed she was at some upscale restaurant across town. This place, Arbor Hill. My heart was pounding so loud it felt like I could barely hear my own thoughts. I got in the car, driven by instinct, half hoping she'd be at some team dinner, half dreading I'd find exactly what I feared. When I walked into the restaurant, my hands were practically trembling. It didn't take long to spot her. She was sitting at a small table tucked in the back corner, her head close to someone else's. A guy I didn't recognize, laughing like I hadn't seen her laugh in months. And then, in the dim restaurant light, I watched her lean in, her lips touching his. The moment froze. My whole world shifted on its axis as I stood there, barely breathing. I must have looked insane standing in the middle of the restaurant, bouquet in hand, frozen like a statue. And that's when I made my decision. I pulled the little gift out of my pocket, a bracelet I'd bought her just last week, thinking it might cheer her up, and walked right over to their table. I set it down between them, not saying a word. She looked up, her eyes widening, and for a split second, she just sat there, like a deer caught in headlights. The other guy, a clean-cut, suit and tie type, looked at me, confused, maybe even embarrassed. I locked eyes with her for a moment that felt like it lasted hours. Then I turned around and walked out, the empty pit in my stomach replaced by a hollow, burning ache. I didn't say a word, but I could feel her shock, and maybe even a hint of fear, trailing behind me as I left. That night, I barely slept. My mind was replaying the scene over and over, torturing me with every detail. The way she laughed with him, the way she touched his arm like she used to do with me, the stunned look in her eyes when I set that bracelet down on the table. I'd left her there without a single word, and part of me regretted it. Another part, though, knew it was better that way. Talking then would have led to nothing but an ugly scene in front of strangers. The next morning, I didn't reach out. I didn't need to. By 7 a.m., she was at our door, knocking softly before she let herself in. I could hear her hesitant footsteps moving from the front door into the kitchen, where I sat, staring at my untouched coffee. She paused in the doorway, waiting for me to look up. But I didn't. Not at first. "James?" She finally started, her voice soft. She sounded almost careful, as if she were picking each word like it was a shard of glass she might cut herself on. I kept my eyes on the coffee cup. "You've got something to say?" She took a step closer but stopped herself, hands twisting together in front of her. "Look, I can explain last night. It's not what you think." I scoffed at that. Couldn't help it. "Not what I think?" I repeated, looking up at her for the first time. "So, help me understand." Because from where I was standing, it looked pretty damn clear. Her face flushed, her eyes darting around as if searching for a believable answer. "That was just a friend. We had a couple of drinks and I got too close. It was stupid, I know. I didn't want you to find out like this." There it was. A half-hearted confession with a handful of words meant to make it seem harmless, like some meaningless slip-up. I felt the anger rising, hot and furious, but I forced myself to stay calm. A friend, I echoed, standing up slowly. The same friend you've been working late with for the past month? The same friend you've been hiding messages from? The same friend you kissed in a restaurant on the other side of town? Her face paled. She hadn't expected me to throw all of that back at her. And I could see her mind racing, trying to come up with something that would defuse the situation. Instead, she doubled down. You don't understand, James. It's not like that, she insisted, her voice starting to rise. Things have just been complicated lately. I've been stressed, and this is just how I was coping. It doesn't mean anything. You're making this a bigger deal than it is. Her words hit like a slap, and for a moment, I was genuinely stunned. Here she was, trying to twist this whole thing into some accidental blip in our marriage, as if the image of her kissing that man hadn't been burned into my memory. As if this was somehow my fault for not understanding. You're unbelievable, Sarah, I said, my voice low but steady. I caught you cheating on me, and now you're trying to tell me I'm the one blowing things out of proportion? Have you even thought about what you've done? She crossed her arms, looking more defiant than remorseful. Oh, so I'm the bad guy now? Just because you saw one moment and jumped to conclusions? She took a step forward, her tone growing colder. You don't know how hard it's been, feeling so distant from you all the time. You've been working late. You barely even notice me anymore. And you act like this whole thing is a complete surprise. A surge of disbelief washed over me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was standing there, putting the blame back on me, acting like I'd somehow driven her into this guy's arms. And as she went on, all I could feel was this deep, sickening sense of betrayal. This realization that the woman I thought I knew had turned into someone unrecognizable, someone cold and calculating, twisting her guilt into some warped justification. I held up a hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. Stop, I said. Just stop. You don't get to rewrite this story and make me the villain. I didn't ask for this. I didn't choose this. I took a steadying breath. But you did. You made your choice. For a second, her expression wavered, but just as quickly, her face hardened, like she'd already decided she wasn't going to let me get the last word. Fine, she snapped, grabbing her bag off the counter. If that's what you want to believe, then I guess I can't stop you. With that, she turned and stormed out of the kitchen, leaving me standing alone, feeling more hollow than I'd ever felt in my life. After Sarah stormed out, I stayed there, rooted in place, the silence of the kitchen pressing in around me. I wanted to feel anger, but all I felt was this gnawing emptiness. It was like something had been ripped out of me, leaving nothing but an ache I couldn't ignore. I kept thinking about her words, the way she twisted the blame, the way she brushed off what I saw with my own eyes. I spent that whole weekend in a daze. She didn't come home, didn't even try to call or explain herself, and part of me hoped she wouldn't. But by Sunday night, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I needed to understand the depth of this lie she'd been living. So, I did something I'd never done before. I went through her things. I knew her passcode by heart. She'd always been careless with it, assuming I'd never look. I unlocked her phone and opened her messages. The first few texts seemed innocent enough, work chats, messages from friends. But when I scrolled further back, I found a number with no contact name, only the messages filling the screen with a sickening regularity. My fingers hesitated, almost afraid to touch them. But I read on. Last night was amazing. Can't stop thinking about you. Are you free this weekend? I'll make an excuse again. I miss you. Can't wait to see you again. The messages went on, each one twisting the knife deeper. The timestamps went back months, maybe longer. And the details, small things, inside jokes between them, shared moments she had never once mentioned to me. This wasn't just some fling or mistake. This was a second life, one she'd been hiding right under my nose. The messages painted a picture more intimate, more sickeningly familiar than I'd imagined. He knew details about her that she'd once shared only with me. He knew things about me, small details she must have confided in him. Things like how I hated pickles or how I got nervous about my job reviews. It was the ultimate betrayal, not just of my trust, but of everything we'd shared. She'd taken our life, every small, private part of it, and handed it over to someone else. Then something caught my eye, photos. My thumb froze above the gallery icon. I knew I shouldn't look, Knew I'd regret it. But I clicked. The first photo that appeared was a selfie of her with him, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in months, her arm around his shoulder, his hand on her waist. And then another. A picture of them at a lake, a place she'd always said she wanted us to go together someday. In one photo, she was even wearing a bracelet I'd bought her last Christmas, one she'd claimed she'd lost just a few months back. I had to stop. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone. I couldn't look anymore. I felt like I was suffocating, like I'd woken up in a nightmare with no way out. This wasn't the woman I'd married, the person I'd built a life with. This was a stranger, someone who could lie, cover her tracks, and laugh with someone else while I was left in the dark. I threw her phone onto the couch, feeling a rage I couldn't contain. Every nerve in my body wanted to confront her, to force her to look me in the eye and admit what she'd done. But I knew if I faced her now, I'd say things I couldn't take back. Instead, I grabbed my keys and left, driving with no destination, just trying to escape the storm inside me. That night, I drove for hours, the empty road stretching endlessly in front of me. I had nowhere to go, no plan, just this furious, helpless energy pushing me forward. Eventually, I found myself at the edge of a lake, one I'd once planned for us to visit together. I parked, stepped out, and leaned against the car, watching the dark water ripple in the moonlight. My mind was filled with memories. Our first date, the way she used to hold my hand in crowded places, the mornings when she'd lie next to me, tracing lazy patterns on my arm. And now all of it felt like a lie, cheapened by her betrayal. I didn't know how long I stood there, but at some point, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was her. Text after text appeared on the screen, all of them vague, pitiful attempts to check in. Where are you? We need to talk. Please, just come home so we can fix this. Fix this. The audacity of those words made my blood boil. I wanted to throw my phone into the lake, to cut myself off from her completely, but instead, I made a decision. I got back in the car and drove home, fueled by the need to finally confront her head-on, to tear down whatever flimsy defenses she'd built. When I arrived, it was past midnight. The house was dark, save for the dim glow of the kitchen light. I walked in quietly, but she was there, sitting at the table, her face buried in her hands. She looked up as soon as she heard the door, her eyes swollen and red, her hair a mess. She looked every bit the image of someone sorry. But I could see it for what it was, an act. Where have you been? She asked, her voice breaking, as if she was the one hurt. I shut the door behind me slowly, taking my time before answering. Does it really matter? You seem to have things handled just fine with your friend. I practically spat the word, and she flinched. Good. She swallowed, trying to keep her voice steady. James, I know you're hurt, but if you'll just let me explain. No. I cut her off, stepping forward. You've done plenty of explaining. I saw the texts, Sarah. All of them. The photos, too. Her face went white, and for a brief moment, I saw something in her expression. A flash of panic, a crack in her armor. You went through my phone? She whispered, as if that was the worst offense in the room. Oh, I'm sorry, that's what you're worried about? I said, unable to keep the anger from my voice. You had no problem sneaking around behind my back for months, maybe longer. You had no problem lying, keeping secrets, sharing every little part of our life with someone else. And now you're upset because I looked at your phone. She stood up, arms folded across her chest like she was building a shield. This isn't fair, James. You don't understand what it's been like for me. I felt neglected, unseen. You were so wrapped up in your own world. You didn't even notice I was struggling. I didn't mean for this to happen. I just needed someone who was there for me. Her words cut, twisting the knife with that sickening precision. She was standing there, shifting the blame, trying to paint herself as the victim, while I was the one left with the shards of what I thought was a solid marriage. I took a deep breath, fighting to keep myself from exploding. Don't you dare make this about me, I said, my voice low and steady. Don't you dare stand there and act like I'm the reason you threw away our marriage. I've been here, Sarah. I was always here while you were off coping with some guy behind my back. I thought we were partners. I trusted you, and you took every part of that trust and shattered it. Her face twisted, a defensive anger flashing in her eyes. And what was I supposed to do, James? Just sit here and wait for you to notice me? To make time for us? I had needs too. I needed to feel loved. And you were just never there. The weight of her words crashed over me, almost laughably hypocritical. She wanted love, she wanted attention, and her answer was to run to someone else? To kiss him, to share our life with him while lying to my face every day? You know what? I said, letting out a hollow laugh. I was an idiot. I kept believing in us even when I could tell something was off. I ignored every warning sign, every little clue, because I didn't want to face the truth. But I'm done being the fool here. She took a step back, her face falling, as if she finally grasped the gravity of what was happening. James, I didn't want it to end like this. Then maybe you shouldn't have started it in the first place, I said, barely able to look at her. The silence that filled the room after that was unbearable. She was still standing there, looking at me, her lips slightly parted like she was going to say something. But nothing came. No more excuses, no more blame shifting. Just a quiet, pitiful silence. Finally, I turned away, heading toward the stairs, every step feeling heavier than the last. As I reached the top, I looked back down at her, standing alone in the dim light of the kitchen. This was the woman I'd shared my life with, the woman I trusted more than anyone. And now all I felt was this deep, aching emptiness, a sense that something had died between us, and there was no bringing it back. She didn't follow me. She didn't say anything. And as I shut the bedroom door behind me, I knew that, no matter what she said next, nothing would be the same. The next morning, the house was dead silent. I woke up in our bed, but it felt like I was lying on foreign soil. Everything familiar now tinged with betrayal. I could still hear the echo of her excuses from the night before, the way she twisted everything to make me look like the neglectful one, the distant one, as if I had driven her into that guy's arms. The absurdity of it all almost made me laugh, but I couldn't muster the strength. When I finally went downstairs, she was in the kitchen, making coffee. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept either. She had that wary look, like she was afraid to speak, afraid of setting me off. Good. For once, she should be the one walking on eggshells. Without a word, I walked past her and poured myself a cup. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but I couldn't bear to hear another excuse. I turned, staring into my coffee, willing myself to find the words to cut through the tension. Are you still seeing him? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She flinched, her hands tightening around her mug. No, James. It ended last night. I scoffed, shaking my head. Oh, so it ended because you got caught. Not because you wanted it to end. Not because you felt guilty. But because I walked into that restaurant and saw you with him. I looked up, meeting her eyes, and I could see her defenses crumbling. But it wasn't enough. I needed more. I needed the truth. How long, Sarah? How long were you planning on keeping this going? Her eyes dropped, and I saw her jaw tighten. I don't know, she admitted. I kept telling myself I'd stop. I kept thinking that it would just fade out, that things would go back to normal with us, and this would be a thing of the past. A thing of the past, I repeated, the words bitter on my tongue. Sarah, you were kissing him, confiding in him. You were laughing with him in a way you haven't with me in months. And you thought that would somehow fade out? That's how you justify it. She bit her lip, eyes filling with tears, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy. Not now. Not after everything I'd seen, every word and photo that had shattered my idea of who she was. It was a mistake, James, she whispered. I swear, I never meant for it to go this far. I thought I could keep it separate. Separate. I laughed, cold and hollow. So that's it then? You had some little compartment in your mind, and you thought you could keep him there while we carried on with our life? Were you planning on bringing him to our anniversary dinner? Or did he already know my favorite meal too? She flinched at that, visibly wincing, and finally her composure broke. It's not that simple, she cried. I was lonely, James. I felt like a stranger in my own home. Every day felt like going through the motions, and he was there. He made me feel seen. There it was again, her reasons, her excuses, her desperate attempts to reframe this nightmare as some kind of inevitable consequence of my supposed failures. And the worst part was that she actually seemed to believe it. She truly thought her actions were somehow a reasonable response to a little marital neglect. "So that's it?" I asked, my voice cold. "Because you felt unseen, you decided to cheat? To lie to my face, day after day? You couldn't just talk to me?" She was silent, her face a mix of shame and anger, like she wanted to argue but didn't have the strength. And that silence said everything I needed to know. There was no real remorse here, just a regret that she'd been caught. Finally, I stood up, feeling a clarity I hadn't felt since I'd walked into that restaurant. "I can't keep doing this, Sarah," I said, each word heavy. "I can't keep pretending that any of this makes sense. I've spent years trusting you, believing in us, and you threw it away for, what? For someone who made you feel seen?" Her face paled, and for a moment, she looked genuinely afraid. "James, please, we can work through this. I'm sorry. I know I messed up, but we can fix this. I don't want to lose you." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time I didn't recognize the person standing in front of me. This wasn't the woman I'd loved, the woman I'd built my life with. This was a stranger, a person willing to burn down our life together for a little excitement and then beg me to forgive her once she realized the flames were out of her control. "Maybe," I said, "you should have thought of that before you let him into our life." Without another word, I grabbed my jacket and walked out, leaving her standing alone in the kitchen. Her apologies echoing in the silence, I left the house without looking back, the door's heavy click behind me signaling some kind of ending. The cold morning air hit me, waking me up from the nightmare that had unraveled in my own kitchen. I needed space, distance from her voice, her face, her endless excuses. I needed time to think without feeling like every step, every thought, was tangled up in her lies. I drove aimlessly for a while, trying to shake off the weight pressing on my chest, but every road, every familiar landmark, seemed to remind me of her, of us. The last 7 years felt like they were crashing down, each memory layered with doubt now that I knew what she was capable of hiding. Finally, I pulled off into a small, empty park on the edge of town. It was quiet here, just the sound of birds and a light breeze, and for the first time, I could actually hear my own thoughts. Sitting alone on a bench, I replayed the months leading up to this, each moment that, in hindsight, felt like a clue I'd ignored. The late nights, the distant expressions, the way her laugh started feeling hollow, like it didn't reach her eyes. I chalked it up to stress, told myself it was normal for couples to hit rough patches, to drift a little. But while I was trying to be patient, to give her the space I thought she needed, she'd been building a life with someone else, sharing parts of herself that she'd kept hidden from me. The thought twisted painfully inside me, and I felt anger bubbling up again. But beneath that, there was something even worse. A quiet, relentless ache that wouldn't go away. I missed her. Or at least I missed the person I thought she was. I missed the woman who used to curl up with me on Sunday mornings, who used to talk about our future like it was something sacred. I wanted to go back, to believe in the illusion that everything was still whole. But there was no going back, not after what I'd seen, what she'd done. And then I felt something else creeping in, curiosity, a need to understand what exactly had led her to this. I knew her words had been twisted and self-serving, but I couldn't shake the question of why. Why had she chosen him? Why had she risked everything we had for something so cheap, so temporary? Did she even love him? Or was it just an escape? The lack of answers gnawed at me, making the betrayal feel even sharper. I pulled out my phone, almost unconsciously, and stared at her number. Part of me wanted to call her, to demand she come clean about everything, no more excuses, no more playing the victim. But I knew it wouldn't help. She'd just find a new way to sidestep the truth. Or maybe she didn't even know it herself. The truth was a stranger to her now, just another thing she could shape to suit her own needs. Still, I needed something, some piece of the puzzle that might help me make sense of it all. I remembered the guy's number from her messages. It had burned into my memory during that nightmarish scroll through her phone. Against my better judgment, I copied it down and saved it to my contacts. Maybe it was a mistake, but I wanted to hear it from him. To know what kind of person had been on the other end of those texts, the other end of that kiss I'd walked in on. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my finger hovering over the call button, wrestling with whether or not to go through with it. Part of me felt ridiculous. Was I really about to call this guy, the stranger who'd invaded my life? But another part of me, the part that needed closure, pushed forward. I hit call. The phone rang, each beat pounding like a heartbeat in my ear. Just as I thought he wouldn't pick up, there was a click, and a deep voice answered, sounding slightly confused. Hello. For a moment, I was silent, unsure of how to start, unsure if this was even the right move. But I took a breath, steadying myself, and spoke. This is James, Sarah's husband. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end, followed by an awkward silence. He knew exactly who I was. He had to. Finally, he cleared his throat, his voice wavering slightly. James, I didn't think you'd ever. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Funny, I said, my voice cold. That's exactly what she said. He fell silent, and I could almost hear him piecing together some excuse, some explanation. But I was done with excuses. Look, I said, my voice low and controlled. I just need to understand. Why did she turn to you? He sighed, and I could hear the weight in his voice, like he knew he'd made a mess but didn't know how to clean it up. I don't know, James. I wish I could tell you. Started as just conversations. She told me things were rough between you two, that she felt isolated. She never said anything too direct, but you know how it goes. One thing led to another. Isolated. There it was again, that word, the one she used to twist the blame back on me. I felt a bitterness rising, but I forced myself to keep listening. And you just went along with it? I asked, a hard edge in my voice. You knew she was married, that she had someone waiting at home for her. You knew all that, and you still. I know. He cut in, almost pleading. I know. I never planned for it to be this way. But there's no excuse. I crossed a line, and I'm sorry. His apology hung in the air, hollow, like it couldn't touch the damage he'd caused. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of thinking it could make things right. Well, I said, the words heavy. You got what you wanted, didn't you? She's all yours now. I hope you both find what you're looking for. I didn't wait for his answer. I ended the call, feeling a strange satisfaction mixed with an even deeper sadness. I'd wanted answers, but now that I had them, I felt even more empty than before. He didn't know her any better than I did. To him, she was a woman who'd felt isolated. To me, she was the woman I'd loved, the woman I'd trusted with everything. And now she was just gone. I sat there, staring at the lake, feeling the cold seep in, but I didn't move. The morning light was creeping over the water, brightening the landscape around me. And in that quiet moment, I finally felt something else start to emerge beneath the pain and betrayal. A sense that maybe, just maybe, this ending could be the beginning of something new. I just wasn't sure if I was ready to face it. The call left me raw, each word ringing in my head. It was strange. Hearing his voice, hearing his guilt and awkward apologies, didn't bring the closure I'd hoped for. Instead, it laid bare how deeply Sarah's betrayal went. She had poured our private life, our struggles, our quiet moments, into someone else's hands and turned to him for comfort. She had invited a stranger into our life, weaving him into the cracks I hadn't even known existed. And now, she wanted me to believe she was sorry, that we could somehow just patch this over and move on. I drove back home slowly, letting the hours pass as I tried to sort through the mess in my head. When I finally pulled up to the house, her car was gone. I was relieved, honestly. I needed space to breathe, to let myself process things without her presence muddying the air around me. But when I stepped inside, I noticed something odd. A few of her things were missing. Her jacket from the coat rack, a pair of shoes from the entryway, her laptop bag. Little details that told me she wasn't just out for a drive. She'd packed a few essentials. For a moment, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Maybe she'd finally come to her senses, realized that leaving was the only right thing left to do. But as I walked through the quiet rooms, the emptiness hit me harder. It wasn't just her things that were missing. It was the sense of normalcy, of routine. I felt like a stranger in my own home, like everything familiar had been subtly changed, tainted. I found myself walking into our bedroom, staring at the bed we'd shared, the dresser cluttered with the small, everyday reminders of a life we'd once built together. I opened a drawer, her drawer, out of habit, and there, right on top, was something I hadn't seen in months. Our old wedding album. She'd tucked it away, apparently untouched since she'd moved on to whatever new life she'd been building behind my back. The album felt heavy in my hands. Part of me wanted to throw it across the room, to rip out every page and toss it into the fire pit in the backyard. But instead, I sat down on the bed, flipping through the pages. Each photo was a snapshot of another time, a frozen memory of the love and hope I'd once believed in. There was the image of her laughing at some forgotten joke, the smile so genuine. Her hand in mine as we exchanged vows, the spark in her eyes as we danced under twinkling lights. And yet, as I looked at those moments now, all I saw was the hollow space where trust used to live. It was like a bitter joke. These pictures, these memories had been the foundation of my life. And now, they were nothing more than reminders of a story that no longer existed. The sound of a car pulling up outside broke the silence, jolting me out of my thoughts. I heard the soft click of the front door opening and knew it was her. She was back. I put the album down, feeling my jaw tighten as I braced myself. This would be the final conversation, and I would make sure of it. She entered the bedroom slowly, hesitating in the doorway when she saw me holding the album. Her face was a mix of guilt and hesitation, like she was searching for the right words to break the silence. But I wasn't interested in hearing another rehearsed apology, another excuse. "I didn't think you'd be here," she said softly. I met her gaze, cold and unflinching. "So you thought you'd just come back and what? Slip away quietly?" She shifted uncomfortably, looking down at the floor. "I needed some time to think. I figured you might need that, too." "Well, you're right about one thing," I replied, my voice steady. "I've done a lot of thinking, and I've come to realize that there's nothing left for us to say." Her eyes widened slightly, and I could see a flash of panic. "James, wait. Please just give me a chance to explain. I know I've made mistakes. I know I hurt you, but we can work through this. We can go to counseling, we can try to fix things. I don't want to lose you." Her words felt like an echo of the past, like something she was grasping for, hoping it would make me stay. But I'd already made my decision. This wasn't something a therapist could glue back together. This wasn't some temporary lapse that we could patch up with a few heartfelt conversations. She had shattered the foundation of our marriage, and no amount of pleading would undo that. "You don't get it, do you?" I said, standing up, feeling my voice tremble with a controlled intensity. "You took something sacred, something that was ours, and you gave it to someone else. You betrayed me, and then you stood here in this house, making me feel like I was the problem. And now you want me to forgive you? To just forget everything I saw, everything I felt?" Tears filled her eyes, but I wasn't moved. "Not this time. James," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I know I hurt you, but I love you. I never stopped loving you." "Love?" I laughed bitterly. "If that's your idea of love, then maybe I'm better off without it." She took a shaky step forward, reaching out, but I stepped back. "This is over, Sarah. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. I can't spend the rest of my life wondering if I'm enough for you, wondering if you're secretly wishing for someone else. That's not love. That's a prison, and I refuse to live in it." Her face crumpled as the weight of my words settled in. She opened her mouth to say something, to argue, to plead, but no words came. And for the first time since all of this began, I felt free. Free from the lies, the constant doubting, the cycle of hoping she'd change, that things would go back to how they once were. I walked past her, leaving the wedding album on the bed, a relic of a life I no longer recognized. She didn't follow me this time. She knew just as I did that this was the end. As I stepped outside, the air felt different, lighter somehow. The weight that had hung over me was gone, replaced by a strange, liberating emptiness. I didn't know where I was going or what the future held, but for the first time in months, I felt like I was stepping into it with my own choices, my own direction. And as I closed the door behind me, I realized that this wasn't just the end of my marriage. It was the beginning of something else entirely. Something unknown, but something that was, at last, mine. Walking out that door felt like shedding a second skin, like dropping the weight of an entire life I no longer belonged to. I'd spent years wrapped up in what I thought was us, always giving, always trying to keep things steady. And now, stepping away from her and from that house, I was struck by the quiet that filled me, an emptiness that wasn't as painful as I'd expected. Instead, it was strangely peaceful, a blank slate, a moment of clarity I hadn't felt in a long time. I drove around town for a while, unsure of where to go. The streets were bright with mid-morning light, the world moving on as if nothing had happened. Couples strolled along the sidewalks. A group of teenagers laughed on their way to the park. People walked their dogs. Everyone seemed to be part of some unspoken routine, caught up in their lives without a single clue about the chaos mine had become. It was surreal, watching people smile and go about their day, while I felt like I'd just come through a war zone. I ended up at my friend Chris's place. Chris and I had been friends since college, the kind of friendship that picks up right where it left off no matter how much time passes. He opened the door, bleary-eyed and still in yesterday's clothes, but as soon as he saw my face, he straightened up, eyes narrowing with concern. "What happened, man?" he asked, gesturing for me to come inside. The words caught in my throat. I didn't want to get into it, didn't want to say the truth out loud and make it even more real. But I knew if I didn't talk now, I'd never be able to move forward. "Sarah cheated on me," I said, each word falling like a stone. "She's been seeing someone else for, I don't even know how long. Months, maybe more." Chris's expression shifted, from confusion to disbelief, and then to anger. "You're kidding," he said, almost like he didn't believe me. But as he saw the look in my eyes, he shook his head, cursing under his breath. That's messed up, man. I don't even know what to say." We sat down and I told him everything. The late nights, the lies, the phone call with her friend, and the way she tried to twist it all back on me. He listened quietly, letting me talk, letting me get the story out in the open where it didn't feel like it was crushing me from the inside. I'd never realized how heavy the silence between us had grown over the years, but speaking about it felt like letting go of a burden I'd been carrying alone. "Man," Chris said finally, shaking his head, "I can't believe she did this to you. You two were the couple everyone thought had it figured out. If anything, I always thought you were the one holding things together. And she just threw it all away." I nodded, feeling a strange relief in hearing someone else say it. "That's the part one can't wrap my head around," I said. "We built so much together, went through so much, and for what? For her to toss it away for some guy who probably doesn't even know half the things we've been through." Chris looked at me, a serious glint in his eyes. "You know, maybe that's the problem, James. Maybe she couldn't handle all the real stuff, the life you were actually building. And instead of facing it, she took the easy way out, tried to escape to something that didn't have all the weight. But that's on her, not you." His words hit me like a revelation. For so long, I'd been turning this over in my mind, wondering if I'd missed something, if I'd somehow driven her to cheat. But maybe it wasn't about me at all. Maybe it was about her own inability to handle the depth of what we had, the everyday commitments, the mundane realities, the trust it took to really make a life with someone. I left Chris's place feeling lighter, like I'd finally taken the first real step forward. He had offered his spare room for as long as I needed it, and I accepted. There was no way I was going back to that house, to the reminders of a life that had become a ghost. That chapter was done, and I wanted to start fresh, even if I didn't know where I was going yet. The first night at Chris's, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the strange mix of pain and liberation. It hurt, yes, more than anything I'd ever felt, but it also felt like a weight had been lifted. I didn't have to worry about who she was texting, where she was spending her nights, or if I'd done something to drive her away. That responsibility, that constant vigilance was gone. In its place was a strange emptiness, yes, but also an unexpected freedom. In the days that followed, I focused on picking up the pieces. I called a lawyer, set the wheels in motion for a separation. Each step felt like closing another door, like drawing a firmer line between my life and hers. Sarah called a few times, left voicemails I didn't listen to, texted to say she wanted to talk things through. But I couldn't bring myself to answer. There was nothing left to discuss. Her reasons, her justifications no longer mattered. One evening, a week or so after I'd left, I took a walk through the neighborhood near Chris's place. The air was crisp, and the streets were quiet, lit by the warm glow of streetlights. For the first time since this had all started, I felt a strange kind of peace. A sense that maybe this was exactly what I needed. A chance to start over. A chance to finally be free of the half-truths and the slow erosion of trust that had been eating away at me without me even realizing. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going back. Not to the lies, not to the doubts, and certainly not to a life with Sarah. I'd given her my best, and she'd thrown it away. Now all that was left was to build something new, something that was truly mine. A few weeks passed, and every day felt a little lighter. A little more like I was building a life of my own again. Living at Chris's place was temporary, but it gave me the space I needed to heal without the constant reminders of Sarah. I threw myself into work, started picking up hobbies I'd let slip away over the years. Things I used to love, like playing guitar, hiking, going to the gym. Slowly, I began to feel like me again. Not the version of myself I'd twisted and bent to keep Sarah happy. Then, one morning, a letter arrived. The return address was my own house, our house, but the handwriting was hers. I stared at it, wondering if I should even bother opening it. I'd ignored her texts, deleted her voicemails, and rejected every attempt she'd made to meet in person. I had no desire to hear her excuses, to let her try to pull me back into her web. But something about this letter felt different. It was a tangible thing, something she'd taken the time to write by hand. Part of me was curious, wondering if she'd finally realized the depth of what she'd destroyed. I took a deep breath, then tore open the envelope and pulled out the letter. Her words sprawled across the page, slanted and a bit messy, as if she'd been in a rush or maybe on the edge of breaking down. I forced myself to read, bracing for whatever she'd try to say. "James, I know you don't want to hear from me. I don't blame you, but I need to try to explain to make you understand. What I did was unforgivable, and I'll live with that guilt for the rest of my life. I wish I could go back and change everything, but I know I can't. I was selfish, and I let my own insecurities destroy the best thing I ever had." Her words hit me with an unexpected weight. I kept reading, even as anger simmered beneath the surface. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about why I did what I did, why I risked everything we had for something so meaningless. And the truth is, I don't even know. Maybe I was afraid of how real things were with you, how much of myself I'd wrapped up in you. Maybe I thought I'd lost myself, and I was looking for some easy escape, something that felt light and simple. But it was a mistake. I know that now." I let out a bitter laugh, wondering if she truly understood the weight of what she'd done. A mistake wasn't a single moment. It was a choice she made, over and over, to lie, to betray, to disrespect everything we'd built. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I won't ask for it. But I want you to know that none of this was because you weren't enough. You were more than enough, James. You were everything. And I ruined it because I couldn't handle my own doubts, my own fears. I let those things drive me to the worst decision of my life, and I'll never be able to undo that." I felt a strange pang reading that line, the words echoing through me in a way that was both comforting and painful. It was some form of admission, I supposed, a confirmation that this wasn't about anything I'd done or failed to do. She'd been looking for an escape from herself, and she'd taken me down with her. The letter continued, a mix of apologies and reflections that felt raw, almost desperate. She recounted memories we'd shared, moments she claimed to still cherish, even though she'd shattered them with her choices. And then, at the end, she added something that struck a strange chord in me. "I know I can't make this right, and I won't ask you to try, but I want you to know that I'm letting you go. You deserve better than the broken pieces of someone who couldn't hold on to the one person who truly mattered. I'm sorry for everything. I hope, someday, you can find it in yourself to be happy again. Sarah." The letter ended abruptly, her signature scrawled messily at the bottom. I sat there, the words swirling around in my mind, filling me with a mix of anger, sadness, and a strange, quiet relief. For the first time, it felt like she was finally taking responsibility. Not just for the affair, but for all the selfish choices she'd made. She wasn't asking me to take her back or forgive her. She was simply saying goodbye. I folded the letter and set it aside, feeling the finality of it settle in. This was it, the end. And for once, there was no bitterness, no lingering desire to turn back and try to salvage what was already gone. She'd finally released me from her, And in that moment, I realized I could let her go, too. A few days later, I went back to the house for the last time. I'd arranged for a moving company to pack up my things, but I wanted one last look around, a final goodbye to the life I was leaving behind. Each room felt hollow, stripped of the memories that had once filled it. I wandered through the empty spaces, taking one last look at the remnants of our life together. When I reached the front door, I paused, taking a deep breath. The house felt like a shell, a place where a life had been but wasn't anymore. And as I stepped outside, closing the door behind me, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a lightness I hadn't known I needed. I walked back to my car, letting the cool air fill my lungs, feeling strangely calm. For the first time, I felt like I could see a future for myself. One not defined by betrayal or broken promises, but by something new, something that was mine alone. The past was behind me, and while it would always be a part of my story, it no longer had control over my life. As I drove away, I didn't look back. The road stretched out ahead, open and full of possibility. And in that moment, I knew I was ready to take the first steps forward, to build a life not bound by anyone else's choices, but by my own. And for the first time, the future felt like something I could embrace. In the weeks after leaving the house for good, my life slowly began to take shape again. It wasn't easy. Grief is a strange thing. It sneaks up on you when you least expect it. Like when you find yourself reaching for your phone to share something, only to remember the person you once shared everything with is no longer there. But each time it happened, each time I reminded myself that I was walking this path alone, it felt a little less painful, a little more freeing. The decision to leave had been final, but moving on took conscious effort. I started diving into things I'd been too busy or too complacent to do before. I signed up for a weekend woodworking class, something I'd once mentioned to Sarah but never pursued. I joined a hiking group, met people who had no idea what I'd been through, who saw me as just another person, free from the shadow of my old life. Each new experience felt like a tiny step toward reclaiming who I was before the betrayal, before I'd wrapped so much of my identity around us. One evening, a few months later, Chris convinced me to go out with him and a few friends. It was a casual night, just a small bar in town, a live band playing, and a steady flow of conversation. I was nervous, hesitant, feeling like I was stepping back into the world of the living after too long away. But as the night went on, I felt myself relax, laughing and talking like I hadn't in ages. And then, toward the end of the night, I noticed someone at the bar. A woman, alone, quietly listening to the band with an easy smile. She wasn't doing anything special, just sitting there, tapping her foot along with the music. But there was something unassuming and genuine about her that caught my attention. I found myself drawn in, feeling a flicker of curiosity I hadn't felt in what seemed like a lifetime. Chris nudged me, following my gaze. "Go talk to her, man," he said with a grin, nudging my shoulder. What's the worst that could happen? Part of me wanted to brush it off, to retreat back into the safety of my own thoughts. But the other part of me, the part that had spent months rebuilding, learning to stand on my own, urged me to take a chance. So, with a deep breath, I walked over and introduced myself. Her name was Emma, and we fell into an easy conversation about the band, about music, and life in this small town. She had a warmth to her, an openness that put me at ease. We ended up talking for hours, losing track of time as we exchanged stories and laughter. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't intense. It was simple, and it felt like a gentle reminder of what connection could be. For the first time since the divorce, I felt a spark of genuine hope, a reminder that life could hold joy again, even after so much pain. We exchanged numbers that night, but there was no pressure, no urgency. Emma wasn't filling a void or mending a wound. She was just someone who made me laugh, who reminded me that there was a world beyond the wreckage I'd left behind. And for now, that was enough. As I walked home that night, I felt a strange sense of contentment, a feeling that I hadn't expected. The hurt, the betrayal, they were still a part of me, etched into my story, but they no longer controlled me. They no longer defined the boundaries of what my life could be. I had walked through the fire, felt the searing pain of loss and betrayal, but I'd come out on the other side whole, standing on my own 2 feet. The next morning, I took a walk to a park I'd found near my new apartment. The air was crisp, a hint of spring in the breeze, and I sat on a bench, watching the world wake up around me. I felt a quiet peace settle in, a sense that I was finally ready to let go of the past and embrace whatever came next. In the end, I'd learned that life could be brutal, that trust could be shattered, but that there was always a way forward. Even when the ground had been pulled out from under me, even when I thought I'd lost everything, there was a part of me that had kept going, kept fighting. And now that part was free. I didn't know where the road would lead, but for the first time in a long time, I was ready to walk it, step by step on my own terms, with hope as my only companion. Months passed, and life settled into a rhythm. It was a rhythm that felt completely mine, each day filled with little moments of solitude and discovery. I no longer woke up with the heaviness of betrayal pressing down on me. Instead, I felt something new, a kind of resilience, a quiet strength that I'd found in the process of rebuilding myself from the ground up. Emma and I stayed in touch, slowly getting to know each other over casual coffees and unhurried conversations. There was no rush, no pressure. She was her own person, and I was finally becoming my own, free from the lingering shadows of my past. Each time we met, I realized how much I valued this slower pace, this freedom to connect without the weight of my history bearing down. Emma seemed to understand without words, offering a gentle companionship that made me feel safe in a way I hadn't known I needed. One weekend, as we sat on a sunny patio overlooking the city, she asked me about my marriage. I kept those details locked away, but with her it felt different. Like sharing them was another step toward moving on, toward closing the book for good. It was complicated. I began, choosing my words carefully. I thought I had it all figured out. I thought we had a future that was solid, that I could rely on. But it turns out we were both living different stories. And by the time I realized it, it was already too late. Emma listened quietly, her gaze steady, full of empathy. "I can't imagine how hard that must have been," she said softly. "To lose what you thought you'd always have." I nodded, exhaling slowly. "Yeah, but losing it made me find myself again. As strange as it sounds, I'm grateful. Grateful to have the chance to rebuild from scratch, to create a life that's really mine." I looked at her, feeling the words come from a place of genuine peace. I guess sometimes, things have to fall apart so we can learn how to put them back together, in a way that's even better. Emma smiled, a quiet understanding passing between us. There was no need for promises, no rush to define what was happening between us. It was enough to sit there, to feel understood, and to know that I had survived something I once thought might destroy me. That night, as I walked home, I realized how far I'd come. There was a lightness in my step, a feeling that the past had finally loosened its grip on me. I thought back to all the moments I'd doubted myself, all the times I'd wondered if I would ever feel whole again. But here I was, breathing, alive, and no longer afraid of what lay ahead. Over the coming months, I started filling my days with plans, dreams, ideas that I'd once put on hold. I joined a travel group, setting my sights on a hiking trip in the Rockies, something I'd always wanted to do but had never quite found the time for. I signed up for a half marathon, got back into guitar, and even started thinking about changing careers, something I toyed with for years. It was like a second lease on life, an invitation to step fully into the unknown, free from the constraints of who I used to be. And one morning, as I stood at the start line of that half marathon, the cool dawn air filling my lungs, I felt a quiet thrill of excitement ripple through me. The crowd surged around me, each person here for their own reasons, their own stories, and I realized I was part of that movement. A single thread in a vast, colorful tapestry, woven together by strength, resilience, and a commitment to keep going. When the race began, I started slow, finding my rhythm, feeling my heart beat steady in my chest. With each step, I felt the weight of the past drift further behind me, replaced by a sense of purpose, of possibility. I was here, I was whole, and I was finally free. Crossing the finish line later that morning, I looked up at the sky, the sun rising strong and brilliant overhead. I knew there would be more challenges ahead, more hills to climb, but I felt ready for them. This was my life now, a life I'd built out of pain and healing, out of loss and hope. And as I walked away from the crowd, from the finish line, I knew one thing for certain. I was exactly where I was meant to be. And for the first time in a long time, that thought didn't fill me with fear. It filled me with hope.